The smell of WD-40 still lingered in my garage that Saturday morning, mixing with the October air that crept through the gaps in the weathered door. I'd been out there since dawn, pretending to organize my tools, but really just avoiding the silence that filled the house like stagnant water. The oak dining table where Margaret and I used to share our Sunday roast dinners sat empty in the kitchen, its surface reflecting the pale morning light. Our wedding photo on the mantel had faded to sepia tones, much like everything else in this house since she'd been gone. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that I was counting. At 72, I'd learned that grief doesn't follow the neat timelines people suggest in their well-meaning condolences. It settles into your bones like arthritis, some days barely noticeable, other days making every movement an effort. The cardiologist had warned me about stress after Margaret's passing, how it could manifest physically, how men my age often followed their wives within a year or two. I'd been diligent about my appointments, my medications, my careful diet of bland responsibility, which is why I was coming home from Dr. Chen's office that afternoon with cautiously good news. My latest EKG showed improvement. My blood pressure was stable. "You're doing better than expected, Robert," he'd said, adjusting his glasses. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What I was doing was surviving, one methodical day at a time. I maintained the house with military precision, the same attention to detail that had served me well in 30 years of municipal engineering. Every surface clean, every bill paid on time, every repair addressed before it became a problem. It was how I honored Margaret's memory, and perhaps more importantly, how I kept the darker thoughts at bay. I pulled into my driveway at 3:47 p.m., noting that the neighbor's maple had dropped more leaves on my carefully maintained lawn. Mrs. Henderson from next door was retrieving her mail, and I gave her the polite wave that had become our standard greeting since Margaret was no longer there to chat over the fence about her prize-winning roses. The first thing I noticed was that something was wrong with the front porch light. It wasn't on, despite the timer I'd set to activate it at 3:30. The second thing I noticed was the small pile of mail that had accumulated by the door. Odd, since I'd specifically asked the Postal Service to hold my mail when I was at medical appointments. But it was the third thing that stopped me cold on my own front steps. The lock was different. I stood there for a full minute, my keys dangling from my fingers like dead fish, staring at the brass deadbolt that definitely hadn't been there when I left at 1:15. The original lock, the one Margaret had chosen when we'd replaced the front door 5 years ago because she loved the antique brass finish, was gone. In its place sat a modern, brushed steel mechanism that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. My house key, worn smooth by 23 years of daily use, wouldn't even slide into the opening. The rational part of my mind, the engineer's brain that had solved countless problems over the decades, began running through possibilities: maintenance emergency, gas leak, police investigation. But my keys also unlocked the side door through the garage, and when I tried that entrance, I discovered it too had been changed. Same with the basement door. Even the old skeleton key that opened the back door from our early years here was useless against whatever had been installed. I walked the perimeter of my own house like a stranger, checking windows that had been secured with new hardware I didn't recognize. The familiar became foreign. The camera doorbell Margaret's nephew had installed last Christmas was dark, its usual blue LED status light absent. That's when Mrs. Henderson appeared at her fence, her expression somewhere between concern and curiosity. "Robert, everything all right, dear?" "The locks," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Someone changed all the locks on my house." Her weathered face creased with confusion. "Oh my, that's strange." She paused, glancing at my front door, and then back to me. "Although, now that you mention it, I did see your son here yesterday morning. He had someone with him, a woman I didn't recognize. They seemed to be working on the house." My son, David. I hadn't spoken to David in 3 weeks, not since our last awkward phone call where he'd asked, again, about my long-term financial planning and whether I'd considered optimizing my assets. At 45, David had inherited Margaret's sharp mind but none of her patience. He'd built what he called a consulting firm that seemed to involve a lot of networking events and very little actual work. Since Margaret's death, he'd become increasingly interested in what he termed our family's financial security. "Did you see what kind of work they were doing?" I asked Mrs. Henderson. "Well, I didn't want to pry, but there was a locksmith van in your driveway for quite some time, and they seemed to be taking measurements of some sort." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "The woman had one of those real estate folders, you know? The kind they carry when they're evaluating properties." The pieces began arranging themselves in my mind with the precision of an engineering blueprint, each element supporting an increasingly troubling structure. I thanked Mrs. Henderson and walked back to my front porch, where I noticed something I'd missed in my initial shock, a small piece of paper tucked under the doormat. I unfolded it to find David's handwriting, hurried and impersonal. "Dad, had to secure the house for insurance reasons. Family meeting needed. Will call tonight. Please don't try to force entry." D. Please don't try to force entry, as if I were some kind of intruder in my own home. I sat down on the porch steps, the same steps where Margaret used to wait for me to come home from work, where we'd watched countless sunsets together, where she'd told me about her diagnosis 2.5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the morning getting good news about my heart, only to come home and feel it breaking all over again. Inside that house were 47 years of our life together. Margaret's jewelry box with her grandmother's pearls, the handmade wooden chest I'd built for her hope chest when we were young and poor and certain that love was enough. Our important documents, birth certificates, the deed to the lake house upstate, insurance policies, the will we'd drafted after Margaret's diagnosis, the small, seemingly worthless items that had become priceless after she was gone, her reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand, her favorite coffee mug in the dishwasher, the half-finished crossword puzzle she'd been working on the morning she collapsed. Margaret had worried in those final weeks about what would happen between David and me after she was gone. She'd always been the bridge between us, translating my practical nature and his ambitious dreams into a language we could both understand. "Promise me something, Robert," she'd said one evening, as autumn painted the trees outside our bedroom window. "Don't let this house become a wall between you and our son." I'd promised, of course. I'd have promised her anything in those days. But sitting on those steps, locked out of my own life, I wondered if I'd already failed her. The engineer in me knew there were logical next steps. I could call a locksmith, though something about the sophistication of the new hardware suggested it wouldn't be that simple. I could call the police, though Mrs. Henderson's account of David's presence complicated any claim of breaking and entering. I could call David directly and demand an explanation, though his note suggested he was expecting that reaction. Instead, I found myself thinking about the lake house, our small cabin 2 hours north, where David had learned to build things with his hands under my patient guidance. We'd spent countless weekends there when he was young, before teenage priorities and college ambitions and career pressures had shifted his focus from craftsmanship to profit margins. Margaret used to say that the lake brought out the best in all of us, washing away the accumulated stress of modern life with each lap against the shore. The lake house where I kept a spare key to this house, in a waterproof container, hidden in the small wooden chest I'd built into the dock. More importantly, the lake house where I kept copies of all our important documents in a safety deposit box at the local bank, along with some cash and other items Margaret had insisted on storing there just in case. Margaret had always been smarter than both David and me when it came to planning for contingencies. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across my locked-out reality, I made a decision that would have made my late wife proud. I wouldn't break down my own door like some desperate intruder. I wouldn't call the police to create a family scandal that would echo through our small community for months. I wouldn't even call David in anger and give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I would do what I'd always done when facing a complex problem. I would gather information, analyze the situation systematically, and develop a solution that addressed the root cause rather than just the symptoms. But first, I would honor the promise I'd made to Margaret by approaching this as a father who still loved his son, even as I prepared to protect myself from him. I stood up from the porch steps, straightened my shoulders, and walked to my car. The lake house was 2 hours away, and I had a lot of thinking to do during the drive. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught sight of Mrs. Henderson still watching from her window. I gave her another wave, this one more confident than the last. I had no idea yet what David had done or why he'd done it, But I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about changing locks. This was about power, control, and the complicated mathematics of family loyalty when money enters the equation. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper from the passenger seat beside me. "Don't let fear of losing him turn you into someone you're not, Robert. But don't let love blind you to who he's becoming either." The road stretched ahead, and I pressed gently on the accelerator. Time to find out what my son thought he was protecting me from, and what he was really protecting himself toward. The drive to the lake house gave me time to think, which turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. 2 hours of highway hypnosis allowed my engineer's mind to process what had happened with methodical precision. But it also gave my father's heart plenty of opportunity to conjure increasingly dark scenarios. By the time I reached the gravel road that wound down to our small piece of paradise, I had mentally cataloged every conversation with David over the past 6 months, searching for clues I might have missed. The repeated questions about my health, his sudden interest in my financial advisor, the way he'd started referring to our family assets instead of your house or your savings. The lake house sat exactly as Margaret and I had left it after our last visit together 3 summers ago. She'd been too weak by then to help with much, but she'd insisted on coming one final time to watch me refinish the small dock we'd built when David was 12. I could still see her in the Adirondack chair, wrapped in her favorite quilt, directing my work with gentle suggestions and sharing memories of all the summers our family had spent here. This was where David had learned patience, working beside me as we replaced rotted deck boards and sealed the cabin's exterior. This was where he'd caught his first fish and built his first birdhouse and discovered that he had a natural talent for seeing how pieces fit together, before spreadsheets and investment portfolios and whatever business ventures currently consumed his attention. He'd been a boy who understood that the most satisfying projects required time, care, and respect for the materials you were working with. The hidden key was exactly where I'd left it, secured in the small waterproof chest built into the dock's support structure. I'd designed the hiding spot myself, using principles of misdirection that would fool casual thieves but remain accessible to anyone who understood the mechanism. David had helped me install it during one of our last construction projects together, back when he was still interested in learning rather than earning. Inside the cabin, everything remained frozen in time. Margaret's crossword puzzle books on the side table, the half-finished wooden jewelry box I'd been crafting for her birthday before she got sick, the scent of cedar and lake water that had become synonymous with family harmony in my memory. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I opened the small fireproof safe hidden behind the bookshelf, another security measure Margaret had insisted upon, and retrieved the copies of our important documents: birth certificates, marriage license, insurance policies, and most importantly, the deed to both the lake house and our primary residence. What I found made my blood pressure spike in ways that would have concerned Dr. Chen. The deed copies were originals I'd stored here 5 years ago, but clipped to them were more recent documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements showing a home equity line of credit for $180,000 that I'd never authorized. A second mortgage application with my forged signature. Most disturbing of all, a quitclaim deed dated just 3 months ago that appeared to transfer partial ownership of the house to David. My hands trembled as I examined the paperwork. The signature looked convincingly like mine, but I had no memory of signing any of these documents. The dates corresponded to the weeks immediately following my brief hospitalization for what the doctors had called cardiac episode related to grief stress. A fancy way of saying my heart had finally rebelled against carrying the weight of losing Margaret. That hospitalization, 3 days of observation while they ran tests and adjusted my medications. 3 days when I'd been groggy from sedatives and focused on nothing but getting home to the familiar routines that kept me functional. 3 days when David had visited faithfully, bringing me books and magazines and handling what he'd called minor paperwork to keep my household running smoothly. I remembered signing things, insurance forms, prescription authorizations, temporary power of attorney paperwork so David could handle my bills while I recovered. Standard stuff, or so I'd thought. My phone rang, jarring me from this horrifying revelation. David's name appeared on the screen. "Dad," Mrs. Henderson called me. She said you seemed upset about the locks. His voice carried that carefully modulated tone he used during what he called difficult conversations. The same tone he'd employed when explaining why Margaret's funeral should be economical rather than elaborate, and why I should consider downsizing to something more manageable. "David," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "We need to talk." "Of course. That's why I left the note. There are some things we need to discuss about your situation. Are you somewhere safe right now?" My situation, as if being locked out of my own house by my own son was some kind of medical condition requiring treatment. "I'm at the lake. David, I'm looking at some very interesting documents right now. Documents with my signature on them that I don't remember signing." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, "Dad, you were pretty out of it after the hospital. The doctors said the medications might affect your memory for a while. We talked about all of this. We talked about a home equity loan for $180,000. We talked about optimizing your assets, making sure you had access to funds if you needed long-term care. You agreed it was a smart financial move." The careful precision of his language sent a chill through me. This wasn't confusion or miscommunication. This was preparation, the kind of methodical groundwork you lay when you expect to be questioned later. "And the quitclaim deed? We talked about that too?" Another pause. "Dad, you're starting to worry me. Maybe you should head home so we can sit down and go through everything together. I have copies of all our conversations, all the documents you signed. We can review everything step by step." Copies of our conversations. "David," I said quietly, "I can't head home because you changed all the locks." "For security reasons. There have been break-ins in your neighborhood. Mrs. Chen 2 streets over had someone ransack her place last month. I was protecting your assets." "From whom?" Look, Dad, you're 72 years old, living alone in a house that's worth nearly $500,000, with no security system and door locks that were installed when Reagan was president. Anyone could walk right in. Anyone except me, apparently. I have your new keys right here. Come over to my place tonight, and we'll get this all sorted out. But Dad, I need you to promise me you won't do anything rash. Don't call locksmiths or police or anyone else until we talk, okay?" The way he said it, like a negotiation rather than a family conversation, told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to proceed. "I'll think about it," I said. "David, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That woman Mrs. Henderson saw with you yesterday. Who was she?" The third pause was the longest yet. "A consultant. Someone who helps families navigate complex financial transitions. Dad, I know this seems overwhelming, but everything I'm doing is for your benefit. You'll understand once we sit down and I explain the whole plan." The whole plan. After I hung up, I sat in the cabin's kitchen chair, the same chair where Margaret used to sort through her seed catalogs each spring, and tried to process what I'd learned. My son hadn't just changed my locks on impulse. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, using my brief hospitalization to establish legal groundwork that would be difficult to challenge. But why now? What had triggered this elaborate scheme? I called my bank's customer service line and worked through their security questions to access my accounts. What I discovered made me understand David's urgency. My checking account showed regular monthly withdrawals of $2,400 for something called Family Financial Consulting. My savings account had been systematically drained over 6 months, with transfers going to an account I didn't recognize. Most tellingly, there were recent inquiries from multiple mortgage companies and investment firms. Someone had been using my financial information to explore additional borrowing options. The sunset was painting the lake in shades of gold and amber when I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. My son, the boy I'd taught to measure twice and cut once, to respect other people's property, to understand that shortcuts in construction led to structural failures, had been systematically defrauding me for months. But the engineer in me refused to collapse under the emotional weight of that revelation. Instead, I did what I'd always done when facing a complex problem. I began to formulate a plan. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper across the water. "Don't let anger make you stupid, Robert, but don't let love make you weak either." I opened my laptop, the same one Margaret had used to research treatment options during her illness, and began documenting everything. Screenshots of the bank statements, photos of the forged documents, a detailed timeline of David's visits and conversations over the past 6 months. If this was going to become a legal matter, I needed evidence that would hold up in court. But more than that, I needed to understand what David thought he was accomplishing. The amounts involved weren't enormous by today's standards, certainly not enough to justify the elaborate deception and the risk of criminal charges. This wasn't about immediate financial gain. This was about control, about positioning himself as the responsible adult managing his elderly father's decline, about creating a narrative where I was the confused old man who needed protection from his own poor judgment. The lake grew dark as I worked, and I realized I'd been sitting in the cabin for nearly 5 hours. My phone showed 7 missed calls from David and 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all and continued building my case file, because I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about recovering my house keys or correcting some paperwork. This was about something much more fundamental, the question of whether I was still competent to control my own life, or whether age and grief had rendered me vulnerable to the kind of financial exploitation that happened to thousands of elderly Americans every year. David was betting that I was too old, too sad, and too confused to fight back effectively. He was counting on my love for him to override my survival instincts. He expected me to be grateful for his protection once I understood how thoroughly he'd arranged my life for maximum efficiency. He had underestimated the man who'd spent 30 years designing infrastructure to withstand forces that couldn't be seen until they started causing damage. As I closed the laptop and prepared for the long drive home, I made myself a promise that would have made Margaret proud. I wouldn't let this destroy our family, but I also wouldn't let our family destroy me. Tomorrow, I would begin the careful work of taking back my life. Tonight, I would sleep in the guest bed at the lake house and dream of the boy who used to help me build things that were meant to last. The first thread had been pulled. Now, I needed to see how much of the fabric would unravel. I spent the night at the lake house, but sleep came in fragments interrupted by the sound of my phone buzzing against the wooden nightstand. By morning, I had 14 missed calls from David, 3 from unknown numbers, and 2 voicemails I wasn't ready to hear. The last text message, sent at 2:47 a.m., simply read, "Dad, please call me. We can work this out." The irony wasn't lost on me that my son was now the one locked out of the conversation he'd been orchestrating without my knowledge for months. I drove back to town, with the morning sun casting long shadows across the highway, my mind focused on the methodical investigation that lay ahead. 30 years of municipal engineering had taught me that structural failures rarely happened overnight. There were always warning signs, stress fractures that started small and spread until the whole system collapsed. You just had to know where to look and how to read the evidence. My first stop was the county clerk's office, a gray stone building that housed the official records of every property transaction in our district. I'd been here countless times over the years for work projects, and I knew exactly which counter to approach and what forms to fill out. "Morning, Mr. Henley," said Janet Murphy, the senior clerk who'd processed municipal permits for me back when I was still working. "Haven't seen you in a while. How can I help you today?" "I need to pull the complete transaction history from my property," I said, sliding my driver's license across the counter, along with a $20 bill for the copying fees. "Everything for the past 2 years?" Janet's expression shifted slightly, the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen enough domestic disputes to recognize the warning signs. "Official records are public information, of course. Are you looking for anything specific?" "Someone's been making changes to my property ownership without my knowledge. I need to see exactly what's been filed and when." She nodded and disappeared into the back room where the computers hummed with the digital heartbeat of bureaucracy. 20 minutes later, she returned with a manila folder thick enough to concern me. "There's been quite a bit of activity on your address," she said carefully. "The most recent filing was just last week." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. The documents told a story I was only beginning to understand. March 15th. Power of attorney registration. Filed 3 days after my hospital discharge. Standard form, properly notarized. Giving David temporary authority to handle my financial affairs during recovery. April 22nd. Home equity line of credit application signed under POA authority. $180,000 credit line approved against the property. May 8th. quitclaim deed transferring 25% ownership of the property to David Henley, in consideration of ongoing care and financial management services. June 30th. Second mortgage application for $95,000, approved and funded. August 14th. Notice of intent to sell, filed by David Henley as authorized representative. October 3rd, just 5 days ago, purchase agreement with Meridian Development Group for $485,000, with closing scheduled for November 15th. My house, our house, the one where Margaret and I had built 4 decades of memories, was being sold in 6 weeks, without my knowledge, without my consent. I sat in my car outside the clerk's office for a full 10 minutes, letting the implications sink in. This wasn't financial elder abuse in the traditional sense. This was a carefully orchestrated real estate transaction disguised as family financial planning. David wasn't just stealing from me. He was erasing me entirely. My phone rang. David again. "Dad, where are you? I've been worried sick." "I'm looking at some very interesting paperwork, David. Did you know that, according to the county, you're selling my house in 6 weeks?" The silence was so complete I could hear his breathing. "Dad, let me explain." "No," I said quietly. "Let me explain something to you. I'm going to hang up now, and I'm going to call my attorney, and then I'm going to call the police, and then I'm going to call the state attorney general's office, because what you've done isn't just theft, it's elder fraud, and it carries federal penalties." "Dad, wait, please. You don't understand the situation you're in." "What situation is that exactly?" "The house is too much for you. You're isolated, you're not eating properly. Mrs. Henderson says you've been talking to yourself in the yard. The woman I brought over yesterday, she's a geriatric care specialist. She thinks you might be developing dementia." The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the accusation, but the preparation behind it. He'd been building a case for my incompetence, documenting my grief as evidence of cognitive decline. "And you think selling my house without my knowledge is the appropriate response to your concerns about my mental health? I think getting you into a proper care facility before you hurt yourself is my responsibility as your son. The money from the house sale will pay for the best assisted living in the state. You'll be safe, you'll have social interaction, you'll have medical staff available 24 hours a day. How generous of you to plan my entire future without consulting me. Dad, I know you're angry, but..." I hung up and immediately called my attorney, Bill Summers, who'd handled Margaret's will and our estate planning for the past 15 years. His secretary put me through immediately. "Robert, how are you holding up?" "Not well, Bill. I need to see you today. Emergency situation involving possible fraud and elder abuse." "My God, are you safe? Do you need me to call the police?" "I'm safe for now. Can you meet me at your office in an hour?" Bill's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian house downtown, the kind of place where you expected to find dusty law books and the scent of old leather. But Bill had embraced modern technology in ways that had served his clients well over the years. Within minutes of my arrival, he had digital copies of every document I'd brought, along with fresh printouts of my original will and power of attorney paperwork. "Robert," he said after reviewing everything, "this is one of the most sophisticated elder fraud schemes I've ever seen. Your son has used legitimate legal instruments to systematically transfer your assets while maintaining plausible deniability about your consent." "What are my options?" "Legally, we have several avenues. The power of attorney you signed was specifically limited to temporary financial management during your recovery period. Using it to transfer property ownership or secure additional loans was beyond its scope. That makes the subsequent transactions voidable." "Voidable how?" "We file for emergency injunctive relief to stop the pending sale. We petition the court to void the quitclaim deed based on lack of capacity or authority. We demand a full accounting of all financial transactions made under the POA. And if David refuses to cooperate, we file criminal complaints for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse." The process sounded overwhelming, but Bill's calm competence was reassuring. This was fixable, but it would require patience and precision. "There's something else we need to discuss," Bill continued. "Your son has been very clever about creating a paper trail that supports his version of events. Hospital records showing you were disoriented after the cardiac episode, documentation of the POA signing with witnesses. even testimonies from neighbors about your concerning behavior since Margaret's death. Mrs. Henderson mentioned she'd spoken to him. He's been building a case for your incompetence for months, Robert. If this goes to court, he'll argue that everything he did was in your best interest because you weren't capable of making sound decisions yourself. The weight of the manipulation settled over me like a heavy blanket. David hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my reputation, my credibility, my fundamental right to be considered a competent adult. What do we do about that? We prove he's wrong. Medical evaluation from Dr. Chen confirming your cognitive capacity. Financial analysis showing your accounts were being managed responsibly before his intervention. Character witnesses who can testify to your mental acuity. I spent the next 3 hours in Bill's office, methodically building a legal response that would protect my interests while preserving whatever might be salvageable of my relationship with David. We drafted demand letters to the bank, the real estate company, and Meridian Development Group. We prepared injunction paperwork to halt the property sale. Most importantly, we created a forensic timeline that would demonstrate David's deception to any court that might hear the case. By late afternoon, I felt like I had some measure of control back. Not complete control, that would take weeks or months to fully restore, but enough to sleep soundly for the first time since finding those changed locks. As I prepared to leave Bill's office, he handed me a business card. Robert, there's one more thing you should consider. This level of financial manipulation often involves other people, enablers, consultants, sometimes romantic partners who encourage the behavior. The woman your neighbor saw might be more than just a geriatric care specialist. I thought about David's defensive tone when I'd asked about her, the way he'd deflected rather than simply answering the question. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that your son might not be the primary architect of this scheme. Someone with experience in elder fraud might be coaching him, providing the legal and financial expertise he'd need to execute something this sophisticated. The drive home took me past David's apartment complex, and I found myself slowing down as I approached his building. His car was in the parking lot, along with a silver BMW I didn't recognize. Through his second-floor window, I could see silhouettes of two people engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. I didn't stop. I'd learned enough for one day about the people my son had become involved with. Tomorrow, I would take the next step in reclaiming my life. But tonight, I would drive to the lake house again and sit on the dock where David had once helped me build something beautiful and sturdy and meant to last forever. I would remember the boy who understood that the most important projects required patience, integrity, and respect for the people who would use what you created. And I would begin planning how to save that boy from the man he'd allowed himself to become. David read through the document slowly, his finger tracing each paragraph like a man reading his own sentencing. When he finished, he looked up with eyes that reminded me of the 8-year-old who'd accidentally put a baseball through Mrs. Patterson's kitchen window. If I sign this, what happens to me legally? That depends on you, I said. Bill thinks we can keep this out of criminal court if you cooperate fully and make complete restitution. But David, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about money. You violated my trust in a way that goes to the core of who I thought you were. He nodded slowly, then pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, but before he could sign, his phone buzzed. I watched his face change as he read the message. She wants to meet. Stephanie, she says there are things about your situation I don't understand. Such as, she says you've been showing signs of cognitive decline for over a year. That mom was covering for you before she died, managing your finances because you were making errors. She has documentation. The calculated precision of it took my breath away. Even now, with her scheme collapsing, Stephanie was still manipulating David with false evidence and manufactured concerns. David, look at me. Do I seem cognitively impaired to you right now? He studied my face, really looked at me for what felt like the first time in months. No, you seem sharper than you have since Mom died. That's because grief isn't dementia, sadness isn't incompetence, and the clarity you're seeing now, that's what happens when someone stops being a victim and starts fighting back. David signed the document without reading it again, his signature heavy and final. Then he reached into his folder and pulled out a set of keys. These are yours, all the locks, the garage, everything. And Dad, there's something else you need to know. What? The house sale. It wasn't just about getting money for your care. Stephanie has been working with Meridian Development on a whole series of properties in our neighborhood. They're planning to tear down 6 houses and build condominiums. She gets a finder's fee for every property they acquire under market value. The scope of the conspiracy expanded in my mind like ripples on water. This wasn't just elder fraud. It was community gentrification disguised as family intervention. How many other families? I don't know. She introduced me to 2 other adult children dealing with similar situations with their parents. I thought it was a support group. David, I need you to call Bill Summers this afternoon and tell him everything. Names, dates, every conversation you had with Stephanie and anyone else involved. Do you understand? Yes. And I need you to stay away from her. No meetings, no phone calls, no text messages. If she contacts you, you refer her to our attorney. What if she threatens me? She knows things about my business, my financial situation. Then she's committing extortion on top of fraud. Let her dig her hole deeper. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of broken trust settling between us like sediment in still water. Around us, Murphy's Diner continued its familiar rhythm. Coffee cups clinking, conversations blending into white noise, the comfortable sounds of a community going about its daily business. Dad, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When did you know? When did you figure out what was really happening? I thought about it carefully. The moment I saw those locks, I knew something was wrong. But I didn't understand the scope until I found the documents at the lake house. Even then, I kept hoping there was some explanation that didn't make you the villain. I'm not a villain. I'm a fool. No, David. Villains hurt people intentionally. Fools hurt people through negligence. What you did required planning, deception, and a willingness to betray someone who trusted you completely. That's not foolishness. That's moral failure. The harshness of my words surprised even me, but they needed to be said. David needed to understand that this wasn't a mistake or an error in judgment. This was a fundamental choice about what kind of person he wanted to be. Can you ever forgive me? I already have, I said. But forgiveness doesn't mean trust. You'll have to earn that back, and it's going to take a long time. David's phone buzzed again. This time, when he looked at it, his face went white. She's outside, in the parking lot. She wants to talk to both of us. Through the diner's front window, I could see a silver BMW, the same car I'd noticed at David's apartment. A woman in her 40s sat behind the wheel, talking on her phone, and occasionally glancing toward the restaurant. I'd stay here, I told David. Finish your coffee. Don't come outside no matter what happens. Dad, she can be very convincing, very manipulative. David, I've been dealing with manipulative people since before you were born. Municipal politics taught me how to spot a con artist from across the room. I walked outside and approached Stephanie's car. She rolled down her window with a smile that I'm sure had charmed dozens of families into financial ruin. Mr. Henley, I'm Stephanie Valdez. I think there may be some misunderstandings about the work David and I have been doing on your behalf. No misunderstandings, I said. I know exactly what you've been doing. The question is whether you're smart enough to cut your losses or foolish enough to keep digging. Her smile faltered slightly. I think if we could sit down and review the documentation I've prepared about your situation, you'd understand that David has been trying to protect you from some very serious financial vulnerabilities. Ms. Valdez, I'm going to say this once, very clearly. I've retained legal counsel. I've filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I have documentation of your entire scheme, including your business plan and fee structure. If you contact me again, or my son, or anyone in my family, I will have you arrested for harassment, extortion, and conspiracy to commit elder fraud. For the first time, her confident facade cracked completely. Mr. Henley, you don't understand what you're doing. The legal protections David put in place were for your own good. If you reverse them now, you'll be vulnerable to legitimate predators who... The only predator I'm concerned about is sitting in this car. Drive away, Ms. Valdez. Drive away and find some other family to victimize. Because if I see you in this town again, I'll make sure every elderly person and their children know exactly what your family transition consulting really involves. She rolled up her window without another word and drove out of the parking lot fast enough to leave rubber marks on the asphalt. When I returned to the booth, David was staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Is it over? The financial part is over. The legal consequences are just beginning. And the personal consequences. I paused, choosing my words carefully. David, your mother used to say that the worst damage people do to each other happens when they convince themselves that hurting someone is actually helping them. She was talking about me. She was talking about human nature, about how easy it is to rationalize selfishness as sacrifice. David nodded slowly, understanding beginning to replace the panic in his eyes. What happens now, Dad? Now you go home and start making a list of every person, every transaction, every conversation that was part of this scheme. Tomorrow morning, you'll meet with Bill Summers and answer every question he asks, completely and honestly. And then you'll begin the long process of learning how to be my son again instead of my caretaker. And us? Our relationship? I looked at this man who carried my DNA and my last name, who'd learned his work ethic from watching me and his moral compass from listening to his mother, who'd somehow convinced himself that stealing from me was an act of love. That depends entirely on you, David, on whether you can figure out how to be someone your mother would have been proud of. I left him sitting in the booth and walked out into the October afternoon, feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because the crisis was over. There would be weeks of legal proceedings and financial reconstruction ahead. But because I'd finally drawn a line between love and enablement, between forgiveness and surrender. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper on the autumn breeze. Well done, Robert. Now the real work begins. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, document signings, and the methodical work of undoing months of financial manipulation. Bill Summers proved to be worth every dollar of his fees, systematically reversing David's unauthorized transactions while building an airtight case that would discourage Stephanie Valdez from targeting other families in our community. But the real work was happening in the quiet spaces between the legal proceedings. The careful reconstruction of trust between a father and son who discovered they barely knew each other anymore. David had been as good as his word about cooperation. He'd provided detailed records of every conversation with Stephanie, every document he'd signed, every rationalization he'd accepted without question. Watching him confront the scope of his own manipulation had been painful in ways I hadn't expected. This wasn't the confident businessman I'd raised, but a middle-aged man who'd been so desperate for financial security that he'd convinced himself fraud was a form of filial duty. The forensic accounting had revealed the full extent of the damage: $127,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, $95,000 in fraudulent loans, and nearly $30,000 in consulting fees paid to Stephanie's various shell companies. More troubling was the discovery that David's own business had been failing for over a year. His consulting firm existed mainly on paper, sustained by the money he'd been siphoning from my accounts. I was sitting in my kitchen on a Thursday morning, reviewing the restitution schedule Bill had negotiated, when David knocked on my door. It was the first time he'd visited since our confrontation at Murphy's Diner, and I could see the nervousness in his posture as I let him in. "Dad, do you have a few minutes? There's something I need to show you." He was carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive, the kind of thing his mother would have bought him for graduation or a new job. Inside were financial documents I didn't recognize: bank statements, investment summaries, loan applications. "I've been working with a different kind of financial consultant," he said, settling into the chair where Margaret used to sort through her garden catalogs. "Someone Bill recommended. We've been putting together a plan for how I can make full restitution without declaring bankruptcy." The documents outlined a 5-year repayment schedule that would return every penny he'd stolen, plus interest. But more than that, they showed a level of financial planning and responsibility I hadn't seen from David in years. "I'm selling my condo," he continued, "moving into a studio apartment across town. I've closed the consulting business and taken a job with Henderson Construction. Remember Mr. Henderson from down the street? He needs someone to handle project management and client relations." I remembered Henderson Construction well. They did honest work for fair prices, the kind of company that built things to last rather than to impress. It was also the kind of job that would require David to use skills he'd learned working with me as a teenager: problem solving, attention to detail, respect for craftsmanship. "The pay isn't great," David admitted, "but it's steady, and there's potential for advancement if I prove myself. More importantly, it's real work, building things people actually need." I studied the repayment schedule, noting the careful budgeting that had gone into every line item. This wasn't the work of someone looking for easy answers or quick fixes. This was the methodical planning of a man who'd finally understood the true cost of his choices. "There's something else," David said, pulling out a single sheet of paper. "I've been going to counseling, group therapy for people who've committed financial crimes against family members. It's not easy, Dad. Hearing what other people have done, understanding how we all convinced ourselves we were helping when we were really just taking." The therapy intake form listed David's presenting issues in clinical language: financial exploitation of elderly parent, rationalization of theft as protection, manipulation by third party. Seeing our family trauma reduced to diagnostic categories should have been depressing, but instead, I felt oddly hopeful. Problems that could be named could be addressed. "What have you learned?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the bird feeder Margaret had insisted on installing, where she could watch it from the sink. "I learned that I was angry with you for surviving when Mom didn't. I learned that I resented having to worry about your well-being when I was struggling with my own problems. And I learned that Stephanie didn't create my willingness to steal from you. She just gave me a way to feel good about it." The honesty was brutal and necessary. For months, I'd been trying to understand how the boy I'd raised could have betrayed me so completely. The answer, it turned out, was that grief and financial pressure had turned my son into someone I didn't recognize, someone he didn't recognize either. The therapist says that the people who commit this kind of crime often see their elderly relatives as assets rather than individuals. We start thinking of them as problems to be managed rather than people to be respected. "Is that how you saw me?" "Yes," David said quietly. "I'm ashamed to admit it, but yes. After Mom died, you became this burden I was responsible for, this liability that might make expensive mistakes or become a target for scammers. I never asked what you wanted or needed. I just assumed I knew better." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of that admission settling between us. Outside, a cardinal landed on Margaret's bird feeder, its bright red plumage a flash of color against the gray November sky. "David, can I ask you something? Anything? What changed? What made you stop seeing me as a burden and start seeing me as your father again?" He smiled for the first time since entering the house, a genuine expression that reminded me of the boy who used to help me build birdhouses in the garage. "Honestly, it was when you outmaneuvered Stephanie in the parking lot. Watching you handle her like a professional con artist who'd picked the wrong target. That's when I remembered who you really are. Not some confused old man who needed protection, but the guy who taught me that the best defense against being fooled is understanding exactly how the trick works." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of hurt and disappointment that had been growing tighter for months. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of forgiveness, the foundation on which trust could eventually be rebuilt. "There's something I need to tell you too," I said. "I've been making some changes of my own." I showed him the documents I'd been working on with Bill, a new will that established clear boundaries around inheritance, a living trust that would protect my assets while ensuring David would benefit from them eventually, and most importantly, a detailed healthcare directive that specified exactly how I wanted decisions made if I ever became incapacitated. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I explained. "I'm doing it to protect both of us from the kind of situation that made Stephanie's scheme possible in the first place." David reviewed the paperwork carefully, and I could see him processing the implications. The new arrangements would prevent anyone from manipulating my finances during a health crisis, but they would also require David to demonstrate trustworthiness over time before gaining any control over family assets. "This is fair," he said finally. "More than fair, considering what I did." "It's not about fairness, David. It's about learning from our mistakes. Both of us." "Both of us?" "I made mistakes too. I isolated myself after your mother died. I stopped communicating with you about my plans and concerns. I created the very vulnerability that Stephanie exploited." It was the first time I'd acknowledged my own role in the crisis, and I could see the relief in David's eyes as he realized I wasn't placing all the blame on his shoulders. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we both do the work. You honor your restitution agreement and prove that you can be trusted with responsibility again. I work on being the kind of father who stays engaged with his family instead of withdrawing into grief. and our relationship. I looked at this man who carried Margaret's eyes and my stubborn streak, who'd learned everything important from us and then temporarily forgotten all of it under pressure. We rebuild it, carefully, honestly, without shortcuts or assumptions or the kind of good intentions that pave roads to hell. David nodded, understanding that this wasn't a reunion, but a beginning. The work of becoming father and son again would take time, patience, and the willingness to see each other clearly rather than through the filters of expectation and disappointment. Dad, there's one more thing. I know this might sound presumptuous, but would you consider letting me help you with some projects around the house? Not financial stuff. I know that's off limits for now. But maybe some of the maintenance work you've been putting off? I thought about the loose boards on the front porch, the garage door that had been sticking, the small repairs that had been accumulating while I focused on larger crises. On one condition, I said. What's that? We start with the bird feeder. Your mother always said it needed to be repositioned to catch the morning sun better. It's time we listened to her. For the first time in months, David laughed. A real laugh that reminded me of Saturday mornings, when he was young and eager to help with whatever project I was tackling. Deal, he said. When do we start? Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, and David, bring your work gloves. We're gonna do this right. The community center on Maple Street had seen better days, but its worn wooden floors and faded paint somehow made it the perfect venue for what I had planned. I'd reserved the main hall for what the booking form euphemistically called a family meeting, though what I really intended was something closer to a reckoning. It had been 6 weeks since David signed the restitution agreement, 4 weeks since Stephanie Valdez fled town ahead of a grand jury investigation, and 2 weeks since I discovered the full scope of what had been done to other families in our community. Bill Summers had been right about the larger conspiracy. We'd identified 8 other elderly residents who'd been targeted by similar schemes, all of them isolated by recent losses and estranged from children who'd been recruited as unwitting accomplices. But today wasn't about the legal proceedings or the financial restitution. Today was about something Margaret had taught me long before David was born, that healing requires truth, and truth requires witnesses. I arrived at the community center at 10 a.m. to find David already there, arranging folding chairs in a circle like he was setting up for an AA meeting, which, in a way, he was. His therapist had suggested that confronting the scope of his actions in front of people who mattered to him might help break through the psychological defenses that had allowed him to rationalize theft as protection. "You sure about this, Dad?" he asked as I set a wooden box on the central table, the same box I'd built for Margaret's hope chest 47 years ago. "It feels like public humiliation." "It's not humiliation if you're telling the truth," I said. "And it's not public. These are people who care about both of us." The attendees arrived over the next half hour. Bill Summers with his legal files, Dr. Chen with my medical records, Mrs. Henderson representing the neighbors who'd watched our family drama unfold, Pastor Williams from the church where Margaret's funeral had been held, and most importantly, David's Aunt Sarah, Margaret's sister, who'd driven down from Albany because she'd said someone needed to represent Margaret's interests in whatever was about to happen. The last person to arrive was Janet Murphy from the county clerk's office, carrying a thick folder of property records that told the story of how close we'd come to losing everything. I stood at the head of the circle, looking at these people who represented different aspects of our community life, and felt the weight of what I was about to do. Not to David, but for him. Because sometimes the only way to move forward is to acknowledge publicly where you've been. "Thank you all for coming," I began. 6 weeks ago, I came home from a medical appointment to find that my son had changed the locks on my house. What I discovered over the following days was that he'd also systematically stolen more than $250,000 from my accounts, forged my signature on legal documents, and arranged to sell my home without my knowledge or consent. The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. David's face had gone pale, but he didn't look away or try to minimize what I was saying. I could have handled this quietly. I could have accepted David's restitution and moved on without involving anyone else. But I realized that what happened to our family was part of a larger problem, one that affects dozens of elderly people in our community every year. I opened the wooden box and removed a stack of documents that Bill and I had prepared. Medical records proving my cognitive competence, financial statements showing my responsible management of assets, character references from neighbors and doctors and the contractors who'd worked on my house over the years. This is the evidence that proves I was never the confused, declining old man that David convinced himself I was. These documents show that I was grieving, not demented, sad, not incompetent, learning to live without my wife, not losing my ability to manage my own life. I handed the medical evaluation to Dr. Chen, who read it aloud. Excellent cognitive function, no signs of dementia or decline, mild depression consistent with bereavement, but fully capable of making independent decisions about health, finances, and living arrangements. Next, I gave Janet the property records that showed how systematically David had manipulated my assets. She read the timeline in her careful clerk's voice: power of attorney abuse, unauthorized loans, fraudulent property transfers, a scheduled sale that would have left me homeless while enriching a criminal conspiracy. But here's what those documents don't show, I continued, pulling out a different set of papers from the box. They don't show how a good man with a failing business and mounting debt convinced himself that stealing from his father was an act of love. They don't show how a professional con artist exploited that desperation to orchestrate a scheme that targeted vulnerable families throughout our community. David spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of what he was saying. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said, standing up slowly. "My father isn't telling you this story to humiliate me or to justify his actions in stopping me. He's telling you this story because he wants to prevent it from happening to other families." He reached into his own folder and pulled out materials I hadn't seen before. Business cards from Stephanie's various enterprises, brochures for family financial consulting services, testimonials from other adult children who'd been convinced that theft was protection. Stephanie Valdez didn't invent my willingness to steal from my father, David continued, but she gave me a framework that made it feel like responsibility instead of robbery. She taught me to see his grief as incompetence, his independence as stubbornness, his trust as vulnerability that needed to be managed. Pastor Williams leaned forward in his chair. "David, help us understand how someone raised in this community, in your family, could convince himself that this was acceptable." The question hung between accusation and invitation, and I watched David consider how to answer honestly without making excuses. "Fear," he said finally. "I was afraid of losing my business, afraid of disappointing my wife, afraid of admitting that I wasn't as successful as I'd pretended to be. When Stephanie showed me how much money my father had just sitting in savings accounts and home equity, it felt like he was being careless with resources that could solve all my problems. But it wasn't carelessness," Aunt Sarah said quietly. "It was prudence. Your father was managing his money the way your mother taught him, carefully, conservatively, with respect for the future. I know that now, but at the time, I convinced myself that he didn't understand modern financial planning, that he was vulnerable to scams and bad investments, that I was protecting him from his own poor judgment." Bill Summers opened his legal folder and spread out the restitution agreement, the criminal complaint that had been filed and suspended pending David's cooperation, and the civil settlement that would make me whole financially while giving David a path back to legitimacy. "The legal consequences are clear," Bill said. "David will repay every dollar with interest over 5 years. He'll cooperate with ongoing investigations into Stephanie Valdez's operation, and he'll accept monitoring of his financial activities to ensure this doesn't happen again." "But the personal consequences," I said, looking directly at my son, "are up to us to determine." I reached into the wooden box one more time and pulled out the last item, a letter Margaret had written to David during her final illness, one I'd found among her papers but never shared with him. "Your mother was worried about what would happen between us after she was gone. She was afraid that grief would make me withdraw and ambition would make you impatient. She wrote this for you to read if we ever found ourselves in crisis." David's hands trembled as he took the letter, and I could see him struggling to maintain composure as he read his mother's words aloud. "My dearest David, if you're reading this, it means that you and your father have lost your way with each other. I need you to remember something. Your father is not an obstacle to your success or a burden on your future. He is a man who spent 47 years building a life with me, who taught you everything important about work and integrity and love. If you find yourself thinking that you know better than him about his own life, You've forgotten who you are and where you came from. Be his son, not his caretaker. Be his partner, not his manager. Be someone I would be proud to call my child." The silence that followed was broken only by David's quiet weeping. The first time I'd seen him cry since Margaret's funeral. "I failed her," he whispered. "I became exactly what she was afraid I'd become." "Yes," I said gently, "but failure isn't permanent unless you choose to make it so." I walked around the circle, shaking hands with each person who'd agreed to witness this strange ceremony of accountability and redemption. When I reached David, I handed him a small brass key. "This opens the new lock on our front door," I said. "But it also opens the wooden box where I keep the family documents, the insurance policies, the deed to the lake house, and your mother's jewelry. It's not a gift. It's a responsibility. One you'll have to earn the right to use." David looked at the key like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I don't know if I can be trusted with this." "Neither do I said. "But your mother believed that people become trustworthy by being trusted, not by being monitored. So, we're going to find out together." As the meeting disbanded and people began filing out of the community center, David and I remained in our chairs, separated by the wooden box that had held the evidence of our broken relationship and the tools for rebuilding it. "Dad, what happens now?" "Now we go home," I said. "We have work to do." Spring came early that year, arriving with the kind of gentle warmth that made you believe in second chances. I was standing on the front porch at 7 a.m., watching David's truck pull into the driveway for what had become our Saturday morning ritual. 6 months of careful rebuilding had taught us both that trust wasn't something you restored overnight. It was something you practiced, one small project at a time. The house had never looked better. Every loose board repaired, every squeaky hinge oiled, every surface that needed attention carefully restored to Margaret's exacting standards. But more than the physical improvements, there was something else that had been rebuilt. The easy companionship that comes from working alongside someone who shares your respect for doing things right. "Morning, Dad," David called as he climbed out of the truck, wearing the kind of work clothes that actually showed evidence of work. The expensive suits and designer briefcases were gone, replaced by steel-toed boots and canvas tool bags. The change suited him in ways that went deeper than fashion. "Morning, coffee's ready, and I found something in the basement I want to show you." Over the past months, I'd been systematically going through boxes of family belongings that had been accumulating dust since Margaret's death. Yesterday, I'd discovered something that had been waiting 25 years for the right moment. The original blueprints for the boat we'd started building when David was 20, before college applications and career ambitions had pulled his attention away from handcraft. David studied the plans over his coffee, his engineer's eye noting the careful measurements and detailed joinery that Margaret had helped me design during the winter when we dreamed of sailing together on the lake. "I remember this," he said quietly. "Mom wanted a boat small enough for 2 people but sturdy enough to handle rough weather. We got about halfway finished before you graduated and moved to the city. I kept meaning to complete it myself, but somehow it never felt right without you." The half-built hull was still in the lake house workshop, covered by tarps and surrounded by the careful selection of marine-grade lumber we'd spent months choosing. Margaret had died before seeing it completed, but her influence was evident in every curve and measurement. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that some projects are worth finishing, even if they take longer than expected." David smiled, the genuine expression that had become more frequent as the months passed and the weight of his guilt gradually transformed into the determination to be worthy of forgiveness. "When do we start?" "Today, if you're ready." "But David, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about building a boat. This is about proving to both of us that we can create something beautiful together, instead of just repairing damage." The drive to the lake house took us through countryside that was showing the first signs of spring renewal, new leaves unfurling, wildflowers beginning to bloom, the landscape rebuilding itself with patient persistence. It seemed like the perfect metaphor for what we were attempting to do with our relationship. The workshop smelled of sawdust and lake water, familiar scents that carried memories of countless projects spanning decades of father-son collaboration. When we pulled away the tarps, the half-finished boat looked exactly as we'd left it, a promise interrupted but not abandoned. "She's still beautiful," David said, running his hand along the smooth hull. "Mom had a good eye for lines. She had a good eye for everything, including people's potential for growth. We spent the morning assessing what needed to be done to complete the project. The hull was sound, but the interior work remained unfinished. Deck planking, cabin construction, rigging installation, probably 6 months of careful weekend work if we maintained the standards Margaret would have expected. As we measured and planned, David brought up something that had been weighing on his mind. "Dad, I've been thinking about the trust arrangements you set up, the ones that prevent me from accessing family assets until I've proven myself." I looked up from the blueprint I'd been studying. "What about them?" "I think you should make them permanent." The suggestion surprised me. The trust restrictions were designed to be lifted gradually as David demonstrated responsible behavior, eventually returning him to full inheritance rights. "Why would you want that?" "Because I never want to be in a position where I'm tempted to see your well-being as secondary to my financial interests. The restrictions force me to relate to you as your son, not as your heir." The maturity of that insight took my breath away. This was the thinking of a man who had learned something profound about himself and was determined not to forget the lesson. "That's a big decision, David. It would affect your children, your financial planning, your entire future. My children will inherit values and work ethic, not unearned wealth. My financial planning will be based on what I earn through my own efforts. And my future will be determined by the person I choose to be, not by what I'm entitled to inherit." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts as we sanded and fitted and measured. The physical work had always been where David and I communicated best, hands busy with shared purpose, minds free to process larger questions. Around noon, I opened the cooler I'd packed and pulled out sandwiches Margaret used to make for our workshop days. Thick-cut turkey with her homemade mustard, wrapped in wax paper, and accompanied by the kind of crisp apples she insisted were essential for proper nutrition. "She knew we'd be back here eventually," David said, recognizing the familiar meal. "She knew we'd find our way back to building things together." "Your mother was optimistic about human nature in ways that often proved wiser than skepticism." "Dad, can I ask you something that might be difficult to answer?" "Go ahead." "Do you think she would be proud of how we've handled this, the way we've worked through everything that happened?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about Margaret's capacity for seeing potential where others saw only problems, her belief that people could change if they were given reason and opportunity. "I think she'd be proud that we told the truth. She'd be proud that you took responsibility for your choices instead of making excuses. And she'd be proud that we found a way to rebuild our relationship without pretending the damage never happened. But I think she'd also say we still have work to do. Forgiveness isn't a destination, David. It's a practice, something you choose to do every day, not something you achieve once and then move on." As the afternoon progressed, we settled into the rhythm that had always characterized our best collaborative efforts. David's careful attention to detail balanced my experience with materials and techniques. His questions showed respect for knowledge while bringing fresh perspective to old problems. "Dad, there's something I want to show you." David pulled out his phone and opened an email from the district attorney's office. Stephanie Valdez had pled guilty to multiple counts of elder fraud and conspiracy. She'd been sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to all her victims. More importantly, her operation had been dismantled completely, with protective measures put in place to prevent similar schemes from targeting vulnerable families. "Your willingness to prosecute made this possible," David said. "If you'd just handled our situation privately, she'd still be out there victimizing other families. And your willingness to testify made the case airtight. You didn't have to cooperate so completely with the investigation." "Yes, I did. Not legally, but morally. I helped her hurt people. I had an obligation to help stop her." The boat hull gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its smooth curves reflecting our morning's work. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing our progress, about knowing that each careful cut and measurement brought us closer to completing something Margaret had helped design. "David, I want to ask you something." "Anything?" "When this boat is finished, when we've worked through all the legal complications from last year, when you've completed your restitution payments, what kind of relationship do you want us to have?" He stopped sanding and looked at me directly, his expression serious and thoughtful. "I want us to be family, Not in the obligatory way that people say when they mean blood relations, but in the chosen way that people who genuinely like and respect each other. I want to be someone you're proud to call your son, not just someone you're stuck with because of genetics. And how do we get there? The same way we're rebuilding this boat, carefully, patiently, with respect for the materials we're working with and the standards we want to meet. As the sun began to set over the lake, we cleaned our tools and secured the workshop for another week. The boat was still months from completion, but the progress was undeniable. Like our relationship, it was being rebuilt stronger than it had been before, with better materials and deeper understanding of what it needed to last. Same time next week? David asked as we loaded our gear. Same time next week, I agreed. But David, next time, bring your work gloves, the ones with actual wear on them. He laughed, understanding that this was my way of acknowledging how much he'd changed, how the soft-handed businessman had been replaced by someone who wasn't afraid of honest work. Driving home through the gathering dusk, I thought about Margaret's prediction that the house could become a wall between David and me, or it could become a bridge. She'd been right about the danger, but she'd also been right about the possibility. The front door key in my pocket wasn't just brass and metal anymore. It was a symbol of trust, carefully rebuilt, of access earned rather than assumed, of a family that had chosen to heal rather than simply survive. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper from the passenger seat. Well done, Robert. Both of you. The road stretched ahead, and I pressed gently on the accelerator, eager to get home to the house where trust lived alongside forgiveness, where locked doors had been opened not by force but by truth.